The Cursed Skull of Bettiscombe. I never believed in curses. The very idea seemed ridiculous to me. Just superstitious nonsense passed down through generations to frighten children. But that was before I bought the house in Bettiscombe. It was an old place, the kind you'd imagine in some classic ghost story. Stone walls weathered by time, ivy creeping up the sides, and a chill in the air that never seemed to dissipate, no matter how warm the day was. But the price was too good to pass up, and I wasn't the kind of person who's scared easily. The estate agent mentioned the house's history with a smirk, as if daring me to believe in the local legends. She told me about the cursed skull, how it had been in the house for centuries, and how anyone who tried to remove it met with a tragic end. I brushed it off, of course, laughing at the absurdity of it all. The skull was kept in a small, dusty box in the attic, just as the agent had described. It looked old, ancient even, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare right through you. There was something unsettling about it, I'll admit. But I wasn't about to let a piece of bone dictate how I lived my life. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I settled in, unpacking my things, getting used to the creaks and groans of the old structure. But on the third night, something changed. I was woken up by a loud crash from the attic, like something heavy had fallen. I groggily made my way up the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. When I opened the door to the attic, I found the skull lying on the floor, the box it had been kept in shattered into pieces. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked it up, its empty eye sockets staring back at me. I set it back on the shelf and turned to leave. But as I reached the door, I heard a faint whisper. It was so quiet, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but it sent a shiver through me. The next day I decided I'd had enough of the skull. Superstition or not, I wasn't comfortable with it in the house anymore. I drove out to the edge of the property, dug a hole, and buried it deep in the ground. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow darker than it should have been. And then just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. A whisper, clearer this time, right next to my ear. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the story of the skull get to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find deep scratch marks on the walls of the attic, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The skull was back on the shelf, as if it had never been moved. I felt a growing sense of dread, the kind that gnaws at you and refuses to let go. I needed to know more about the skull, about the curse that supposedly came with it. I started digging into the history of the house, reading old records and talking to the locals. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. The skull wasn't just some random relic. It had a dark history, one that seemed to cling to it like a shadow. People who had lived in the house before me had all met with untimely deaths, each one more horrific than the last. One had fallen down the stairs, breaking their neck in the same spot where I had found the skull. Another had drowned in the nearby river, despite being an excellent swimmer. The most recent owner had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but the skull. The whispers grew louder each night, sometimes calling my name, sometimes speaking in a language I didn't understand. The air in the house grew colder, and I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. Figures standing in the corners of rooms that vanished when I turned to look. I knew I needed to get out of the house, but something was holding me back. It was as if the skull had a grip on me, a pull that I couldn't resist. The locals warned me to leave it alone, to let it be, but I couldn't. I needed to know more, needed to understand what was happening, and then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and I was sitting in the living room trying to distract myself with some mindless TV, but the whispers wouldn't stop, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. I could feel something watching me, its presence oppressive and suffocating. And then the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering TV screen. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing in the dark, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I tried to move, to get up and run, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen in place, trapped in my own fear. The figure started to move toward me, slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, just as it reached me, the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. But the terror remained, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house any longer, that the curse was real, and it was coming for me. But when I tried to leave, I found the doors locked, the windows sealed shut. It was like the house had come alive, trapping me inside with the skull, with whatever horror was lurking in the shadows. And then, I heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, coming from the attic. It was calling my name. I didn't want to go, didn't want to face whatever was up there, but I couldn't resist. It was like I was being drawn up the stairs, step by step, closer to the source of the voice. When I reached the attic, the door was already open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a single candle burning in the corner. And there in the center of the room was the skull, its empty eye socket staring right at me. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in fear. And then the candle went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder, squeezing tight, pulling me closer to the skull. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The hand was pulling me down into the darkness, into the cold, empty void where the skull had been waiting for centuries. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the attic, the cold, damp wood pressing against my cheek. My head throbbed with pain, and my body felt like it had been put through a wringer. But I was alive. Somehow I had survived whatever had happened the night before. I slowly pushed myself up, wincing as every muscle protested the movement. The room was still dark, but the candle had been relit, casting a dim, flickering light across the room. The skull was exactly where I'd last seen it, still perched in the center of the room, its empty eye sockets locked onto me as if it were watching, waiting. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But the fear that had gripped me the night before had been replaced by something else. Anger. I was furious at myself for letting a piece of bone have this much power over me. I wasn't going to let it control my life, wasn't going to let it win. I needed answers. I needed to know what this skull was and why it had such a hold on me. I grabbed the skull, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted it off the floor. For a moment I thought I heard a low growl, almost like the house itself was protesting. But I pushed the thought aside and took the skull down to the living room. I spent the rest of the day researching, diving into old books and online forums, trying to find any clue that could help me understand the skull's power. But the more I read, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, and the more horrifying the picture became. The skull was not just any old relic. It was said to belong to a servant who had been wrongfully accused of a crime and executed. The legend went that with his dying breath, the servant cursed the house and anyone who lived in it, swearing that his skull would never leave the property. If it did, death and disaster would follow. Over the centuries, countless people had tried to remove the skull, either out of fear or disbelief. Every single one of them had met a gruesome end, their bodies found mutilated or their minds driven to madness. And now I had disturbed it. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just letting the stories get to me. But the whispers had returned, louder than ever, echoing through the house, filling every room with their ominous murmurings. I tried to drown them out, blasting the television, turning on every light in the house. But no matter how loud the noise, the whispers cut through it, seeping into my mind, whispering dark secrets and terrifying visions. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls, forming shapes that shouldn't have been there, figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the house fell silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows stilled. For a moment I thought it was over, that maybe I had somehow broken the curse. But then the front door creaked open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned to face the door. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out a figure standing in the doorway. A tall, shadowy figure, its face obscured by darkness. My blood ran cold as the figure took a step forward, then another, its movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It stepped into the light, and I felt a scream rising in my throat. It was a man, or at least it had been. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were hollow, empty, just like the skull's. He stared at me, unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I could feel his gaze boring into me, feel the coldness radiating from him. And then in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he spoke. "You should have left it alone." His words hung in the air, heavy with menace. My mouth went dry, and I could barely force out a whisper. Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then with a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the grave, he answered, "I am the curse." The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around me. I could feel the darkness creeping closer, feel the cold seeping into my bones. The figure took another step forward, and I knew deep down that there was no escaping this. I had disturbed something ancient, something evil, and now it was coming for me. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, its nails sharp like claws. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear as the figure's hand closed around my throat. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its breath cold against my skin, and then everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, the sensation of cold, bony fingers still lingering around my throat. My mind was a chaotic mess of fear and confusion, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. I bolted upright, my eyes darting around, searching for the figure, the curse that had attacked me. But the room was empty. I told myself it was just a nightmare, that the stress of everything had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was real. The curse wasn't just a story, it was alive, and it was coming for me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house, away from this cursed skull. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone to call for help. But when I looked at the screen, it was dead. No signal, no battery, nothing. It was as if the house itself was cutting me off from the outside world. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my keys and ran to the front door. I twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled or turned, it wouldn't open. I ran to the windows, but they were sealed shut, the glass unbreakable. I was trapped. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself, to think of a way out. But all I could hear were the whispers, growing louder and louder, echoing through the halls, filling every corner of the house. They were taunting me, laughing at my fear, telling me there was no escape. And then I heard it, a loud rhythmic thumping coming from the attic. My heart leaped into my throat as the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to break free. I didn't want to go up there, didn't want to face whatever horror was waiting for me, but I had no choice. I needed to end this. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way up the stairs, my hands trembling as I held the beam steady. The closer I got to the attic, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. The thumping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was pounding against the walls, desperate to escape. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run as far away as I could. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was up there, needed to put an end to this nightmare. I slowly pushed the door open, the hinges creaking ominously. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from my flashlight, which flickered as if it were about to die. The thumping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I had to cover my mouth and nose to keep from gagging. I swept the flashlight across the room, searching for the source of the noise, but all I could see were the dusty old boxes and the cursed skull, sitting in the middle of the floor, right where I had left it. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I was alone, locked in the attic with the cursed skull. I rushed to the door, pounding on it, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. I turned back to the skull, my chest tight with fear. It was as if the room itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The skull seemed to glow in the darkness, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, drawing me in. I could feel the curse wrapping around me, pulling me closer, suffocating me. And then I heard it again. A whisper, soft and sinister, coming from the skull itself. "Release me." The voice was cold, devoid of any emotion, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, backing away from the skull, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Release me and I will spare you." My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The skull wanted something from me, something I wasn't sure I could give. But what choice did I have? If I didn't do what it wanted, I would be trapped here forever, at the mercy of whatever malevolent force was haunting this house. With trembling hands, I reached out and picked up the skull. The moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through me, and I gasped in pain. But I didn't let go. I couldn't! I needed to know what it wanted, needed to end this. The skull's hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, and for a moment I felt like I was being pulled into them, into a darkness so deep and cold that it threatened to consume me. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the tension in the air like the calm before a storm. And then, with a suddenness that made me jump, the attic door flew open, slamming against the wall with a loud bang. I staggered backward, my heart pounding as a figure stepped into the room. It was the same man from before, the curse, his hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. But this time there was something different about him. He was no longer just a shadowy figure. He was solid, real, and his presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You should not have disturbed me," he said, his voice low and menacing. I backed away, clutching the skull to my chest as if it could protect me. But the figure only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you can escape me?" he sneered. "You belong to me now." I tried to speak, to plead for my life, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me, pulling me down into the abyss. And then, with a sudden burst of courage, I threw the skull at the figure, hoping against hope that it would do something, anything, to stop him. The skull hit the figure square in the chest, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The figure's eyes widened in shock, and then with a deafening roar he was engulfed in flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the figure, the room, everything in its path. I could feel the heat searing my skin, the flames licking at my clothes, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching in horror as the figure screamed in agony, thrashing wildly, as the flames devoured him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fire died out. The room was silent once more, the air thick with the stench of smoke and burnt flesh. The figure was gone, reduced to a pile of ashes on the floor. The skull lay beside it, cracked and blackened, its hollow eyes staring up at me one last time. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. It was over. The curse was broken. But as I sat there, staring at the ashes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that this nightmare wasn't over yet. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the ashes. "You cannot escape me." I sat there in the darkened attic, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the pile of ashes where the cursed figure had once stood. The whisper echoed in my mind, chilling me to the core. "You cannot escape me." I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, a trick of my exhausted mind. But deep down I knew it was real. The curse wasn't gone. It had only just begun. The house felt different now, heavier, darker, as if it had absorbed the terror of the events that had just unfolded. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me, and I slowly backed out of the attic, never taking my eyes off the pile of ashes and the blackened skull. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the house watching me, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder with each step. By the time I reached the ground floor, I was practically running, desperate to get out, to escape the clutches of whatever malevolent force was still lurking in the shadows. I reached the front door and yanked it open. This time it gave way easily, as if the house was letting me go. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I bolted outside, not stopping until I was halfway down the driveway. For a moment I stood there gasping for breath, looking back at the house. It loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. It felt like the house was alive, breathing, waiting, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was waiting for. I fumbled with my car keys, finally managing to get the door open. I threw myself inside, turned the ignition, and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched as I sped down the road, not daring to look back. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Bettiscombe as I could. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that the curse wasn't confined to the house. It was inside me now. I finally pulled over at a motel on the outskirts of a small town. The neon sign flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows on the deserted road. I checked in, barely registering the clerk's concerned look as I stumbled to my room. Once inside, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and checked the windows to make sure they were secure. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, the flickering light casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I collapsed onto the bed, my body exhausted but my mind racing. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the skull, heard the whispers, felt the cold hand on my throat. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a soft, insidious whisper right in my ear. "You cannot escape me." I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, the lamp flickering weakly. I was alone, but the air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but it was dead. No signal, no power, nothing. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled out of bed, my head spinning, trying to shake off the fog of fear that was clouding my mind. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They were taunting me, laughing at me, telling me there was no escape. And then the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I reached out blindly, fumbling for the lamp, but my fingers only met empty air. I could hear something moving in the darkness, something coming closer, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could feel the cold creeping in, the darkness closing around me, suffocating me. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at me from the corner of the room. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be happening!" But it was. The eyes were moving closer, and with them came the figure. The same shadowy figure from the house, the same one that had been consumed by flames. But it was different now, more solid, more real, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You cannot escape me," it said, its voice cold and empty, sending a chill down my spine. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as the figure reached out, its hand a twisted skeletal claw. I could feel its icy grip closing around my heart, squeezing the life out of me. The room spun, the darkness engulfing me, pulling me down into the abyss. And then, just as the last shred of hope slipped away, I saw it. The skull, hovering in the air above the figure, its empty eye sockets glowing with a faint, eerie light. It was watching, waiting just like before. And then the skull spoke. "Release me." The words were a command, a plea, and I knew what I had to do. With the last ounce of strength I had, I reached out, grabbing the skull out of the air. The moment my fingers touched it, a shockwave of energy surged through me, and the figure screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the room, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. The skull's eyes flared with light, and the figure was engulfed in flames once more, its screams piercing the darkness. But this time the flames didn't stop. They grew brighter, hotter, consuming everything in their path. The figure, the room, the darkness itself. I felt the heat searing my skin, the flames licking at my clothes, but I held on, refusing to let go. The skull's eyes blazed with a blinding light, and the figure screamed one last time before it was consumed, reduced to ashes in a burst of fiery light. And then everything went silent. The flames died out, the room returning to its dark, eerie stillness. I was alone, the skull still in my hand, its glow fading to nothing. The whispers were gone, the figure was gone, and the curse was gone. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion, the skull rolling out of my hand and coming to rest beside me. I lay there, gasping for breath, too weak to move, too scared to believe that it was really over. But it was. The curse was broken, or so I thought. As I lay there staring up at the ceiling, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but there all the same. A whisper coming from the skull, the same voice that had haunted me, tormented me, driven me to the brink of madness. "You cannot escape me." And then the skull's eyes flared to life once more, glowing with a sickly, malevolent light. And I knew, with a sinking dread, that the curse would never let me go. The end.